I need a mother for my sons, and you need shelter. The Vampire King proposed to the poor human maid. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's tale. The room was still, the air thick with the weight of what had just been said. Emily stood frozen in place, her heart racing, her mind struggling to grasp the full meaning of the Vampire King's words. I need a mother for my sons, and you need shelter, he had said, his voice low and commanding, yet laced with something she couldn't quite place, something like desperation. She had spent her entire life working as a maid, doing menial tasks for the wealthy, barely scraping by. Never once had she imagined that her fate might intertwine with someone as powerful as the Vampire King. As she looked into his eyes, deep pools of crimson that seemed to pierce her very soul, Emily couldn't deny the strange pull she felt toward him. There was something about him, something dark and mysterious, yet oddly captivating. She could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. His gaze never wavered as he took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. You have nothing, he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. But I see something in you, something that could help me, and perhaps help you as well. Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. The idea of living under the same roof as a Vampire King, a being of such unimaginable power, seemed like something straight out of a fairy tale. But the reality of her situation, the life she led, the loneliness, the constant struggle to survive, pushed her to consider his offer. She had nothing to lose. I don't understand, Emily managed to say, her voice shaking. Why me? Why would you choose someone like me? The Vampire King regarded her for a moment, his eyes softening ever so slightly. You have a strength in you that others do not see, he said, his tone gentler now. A resilience. You've survived, despite everything, and you care for others. That's more than most can say. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Could he truly see her that way? As something more than just a maid? She had always believed that she was invisible, nothing more than a tool to be used by those in power. And yet here was the Vampire King, the ruler of this vast, cold mansion, telling her that he saw something in her that others didn't. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, he held up a hand to stop her. You don't have to answer now, he said, his voice cool, but not unkind. Take some time to think. But know this, if you accept, I will protect you. I will give you a life unlike anything you've ever known. Emily felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear, excitement, confusion. She had always dreamed of escaping the harshness of her life, but the idea of being bound to such a powerful, enigmatic man was daunting. Could she truly trust him? Could she trust herself to step into a world so different from the one she knew? The Vampire King seemed to sense her hesitation. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. I'm not asking for you to make a decision right away, he said, his voice softer now. But think of your future. Think of the protection you and your brother could have. Think of the life you could build for yourself, for your family. Emily felt a pang in her chest. Her brother, the one family she had left, the one person she still cared for. She hadn't seen him in years, and she longed to be reunited with him, to have a life where she didn't have to struggle every single day. The idea of a future filled with safety, security, and even love, however unlikely that seemed, was tempting. But was she willing to accept the price that might come with it? She hesitated, her mind racing as she weighed the consequences. Was she really ready to give up her independence, to place her fate in the hands of someone like him? The Vampire King seemed to sense her inner turmoil. He gave her a small, knowing smile. I'll give you time, he said. But remember this, when you're ready, you know where to find me. With that, he turned and walked away, his dark cloak sweeping behind him as he disappeared into the shadows of the vast mansion. Emily stood there for a long moment, her heart still racing, her thoughts in disarray. The offer he had made, an offer that could change everything, was too big to comprehend all at once. She had never imagined a life like this, one filled with vampires, power, and ancient secrets. But one thing was certain, her life would never be the same again. She had already taken the first step into a world that was beyond anything she had ever known. What would happen next? Only time would tell. Emily spent the entire night pacing in her small room, the weight of the Vampire King's words pressing on her mind. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't think straight. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his crimson gaze, the intensity of his words echoing in her ears. He had offered her something that no one in her life ever had. The chance to be more than just a maid, more than just a forgotten soul. The idea of being the mother of his sons, of living in that vast, cold mansion, of having a life filled with luxury and protection, was tempting beyond measure. But there was a dark side to it that she couldn't ignore. He was a vampire king, an ancient, powerful being who could take what he wanted without hesitation. What would it mean for her to accept his offer? Would she be bound to him, to his world, forever? Would she lose herself in the process? It was too much to think about in one sitting. She needed time. But time was something she wasn't sure she had. The next morning, Emily found herself standing outside the massive gates of the mansion, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made her decision. The rain had stopped, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the world that felt almost too bright for someone like her. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing through the grand courtyard as she approached the door. It was then that she saw him again, the Vampire King. He stood at the top of the staircase, waiting for her. His eyes locked onto hers as if he had been expecting her all along. "You've come to make your decision," he said, his voice low and commanding, yet not unkind. Emily nodded, her throat tight. "I have," she whispered. The Vampire King studied her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Then, with a small nod, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Come in, then. Let me show you the life you could have." She hesitated for just a moment, but then stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the world that would be hers, if she chose to accept it. The inside of the mansion was even grander than she had imagined. The walls were lined with dark wood and rich tapestries, and the floors were covered in thick, plush carpets that felt like walking on clouds. The air was heavy with the scent of ancient wood and the faintest trace of something otherworldly. "This is your new home," the Vampire King said, his voice echoing through the halls. "You will have everything you need. Food, clothing, protection, everything." Emily felt a surge of emotions, excitement, fear, awe. She had never imagined such a life was possible for someone like her. She had dreamed of escaping her hardships, of finding a place where she could belong. But this was not what she had imagined. This was a world of vampires, of power, of ancient magic. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I need a mother for my sons," he said again, his tone almost solemn. "They are my responsibility, my legacy. I cannot raise them alone." Emily's heart skipped a beat. His sons? She hadn't expected that. "I'm just a maid," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Why me?" The Vampire King stepped closer, his eyes softening just a fraction. "Because you have something they need," he said. "You are kind. You care. You are not afraid to stand up for what is right. That is what they need. That is what I need." Emily felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at his words. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she felt something stir within her, something she hadn't felt in years. "What happens if I say no?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The Vampire King's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing. "If you say no, you will remain a maid, nothing more. You will continue to live in the shadows, unseen and unheard." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She had spent her life as nothing more than a servant, a faceless, nameless person who existed only to serve others. The thought of staying in that life, of never having the chance to change, made her stomach turn. "But if you say yes," he continued, "you will have a chance to change everything. You will have a family. You will be loved, protected, and you will never be alone again." Emily's heart raced as she processed his words. It was everything she had ever wanted. But there was so much at stake. Her heart and mind were at war. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself? She looked into his eyes, those deep, mesmerizing crimson eyes, and knew that whatever she chose, her life would never be the same again. I accept," she said, her voice barely audible. The Vampire King's eyes brightened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something softer in his gaze, something like relief. "Good," he said, his voice steady and strong. "Then welcome, Emily. Welcome to your new life." Emily had made her choice. The Vampire King's offer, his proposal, was not something she had expected. A new life, a life of comfort, security, and protection. But now that she had agreed, she was not sure what to expect. It was one thing to dream of a life free of struggle, but it was another to walk into a world so far removed from everything she had ever known. As she followed the Vampire King through the halls of the mansion, the weight of her decision settled on her shoulders. She was no longer just a maid. She was no longer invisible. But what did that mean for her? What did it mean for her future, for her brother, for the life she had left behind? The mansion was grander than anything she had ever imagined. The rooms were vast, adorned with priceless artwork, polished marble floors, and heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the light. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. It was beautiful but cold, like a palace designed to make people feel small. Yet as they walked deeper into the heart of the mansion, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. This wasn't her world. She had barely adjusted to the idea of living in such opulence when the Vampire King led her to a large room at the end of a long corridor. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a space that seemed as if it were straight out of a dream. It was a nursery, or something like it. The walls were painted in soft shades of blue and gold, with a grand crib at the center. The room was immaculate, every detail carefully planned. "This is where you will stay," the Vampire King said, his voice low and commanding. Emily blinked, her throat dry. I don't understand," she stammered. "This is the nursery?" The Vampire King nodded. "It is where my sons sleep, and it is where you will live from now on. You will care for them, raise them, protect them. They are your responsibility now, as much as they are mine." Emily felt her heart race at his words. This was real. She was really here. She was really going to raise his sons, live with him, live in this mansion surrounded by a life she had never dreamed of. But the weight of the responsibility, the pressure, began to sink in. Could she do this? Could she take on such a task? "But I don't know how to care for children," she said quietly, almost to herself. The Vampire King looked at her with those intense crimson eyes, his expression unreadable. "You will learn," he said simply. "I will teach you, if you need it. But I have no doubt you will rise to the challenge. You have the strength to do this." His words, though calm and reassuring, did little to ease her fears. Emily had no experience with children. She had never raised anyone, had never even considered the idea of being a mother. The closest she had come to being a caretaker was taking care of her younger brother when he was still living with her. But even that was a far cry from what she was about to face. "The boys," Emily started, her voice trailing off. "They're just children, aren't they?" The Vampire King's eyes softened slightly, but only for a moment. "They are," he said, his tone almost tender. "But they are also the heirs to my kingdom. They are part of my legacy, and they will be raised to carry that legacy, to rule, to lead. I need you to help them become who they are meant to be." Emily nodded, but it was a mechanical gesture. Her mind was spinning. She could already feel the weight of the Vampire King's expectations pressing down on her. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't just a stranger who had stumbled into this world. She was now part of it, and there was no going back. "I will do my best," Emily said, her voice small, uncertain. The Vampire King regarded her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. "That is all I ask," he said softly. "Do your best, and you will find that in this world, your best is more than enough." He turned, his cloak sweeping behind him like a shadow. "I will leave you to get settled," he said, his voice trailing off as he walked toward the door. "We will have much to discuss later. But for now, take the time you need. Rest. You will need your strength for what is to come." As he left, the door closed softly behind him, leaving Emily alone in the vast, silent room. She walked over to the crib, her fingers brushing the soft linens. This was real. This was happening. She was now responsible for the future of the Vampire King's sons. She had agreed to a life that she didn't fully understand, one that held both promises and dangers she couldn't yet see. As she stood there, alone in the nursery, she wondered what the future would hold, and more importantly, how she would navigate the complexities of the life she had just entered. Emily spent the following days adjusting to her new life in the mansion. It was nothing like she had ever imagined, and yet, everything was precisely what she had always dreamed of. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her heart as she began to settle into the role she had agreed to. Every room, every hallway of the mansion seemed to hold an air of unspoken secrets, a history she was just beginning to uncover. The Vampire King, though distant, had made his expectations clear. He wanted her to care for his sons, to protect them, to raise them. But she had no idea what that truly meant. The first day with the children was far more overwhelming than she had anticipated. The boys, both under the age of 10, were unlike any children she had known. They were not like the carefree children she had seen in the village. They were quiet, reserved, and their eyes held the kind of depth that made her feel as though they knew far more than they should for their young age. The older boy, Alexius, was the more vocal of the two. He was 6 years old, but carried himself with an air of authority that seemed out of place for someone so young. He had the same crimson eyes as his father, and there was an almost intimidating sense of intelligence behind them. The younger boy, Demetrius, was only 3 but had a presence that was just as commanding. His eyes were softer, but there was an undeniable strength within him. Emily could feel their weight of expectation. She wasn't just taking care of children, she was taking care of the future of a vampire dynasty. The Vampire King had explained that his sons were heirs to his kingdom, that they were bound by a destiny she could barely comprehend. She was to raise them to be strong, to be leaders, to be prepared to rule one day. It was a daunting task. One evening, after she had tucked the boys into bed, she found herself alone in the nursery, her mind racing with the reality of her situation. The soft glow of the candles flickered across the walls as she stood by the crib, watching the boys sleep. She had thought about the future, about what would happen to her, and to them, as the days went on. She had thought about her own past, about her brother, and about how far away everything felt now. She had entered this world with nothing but her own will to survive, but now she found herself part of something so much bigger. The Vampire King's words echoed in her mind. You will have everything you need. Food, clothing, protection, everything. But what did that really mean? Emily wasn't naive. She knew that she was part of the Vampire King's plan, but what did that plan entail? Did he truly care for her, or was she just another piece in a much larger game? She couldn't deny the connection she felt when she was around him. There was something magnetic, something powerful that made her feel both drawn to him and terrified of him at the same time. It was a strange dichotomy, feeling safe, yet at the same time, vulnerable. Her thoughts were interrupted when the door to the nursery creaked open. She turned quickly, and there, standing in the doorway, was the Vampire King. His silhouette was framed by the dim light from the hallway, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. His crimson eyes locked onto hers, and she could feel the weight of his gaze pressing against her. You are doing well, he said, his voice low and commanding. The boys are adjusting to you. I can see that. Emily swallowed, trying to steady her nerves. I'm just trying to keep up, she said quietly. I don't know if I'm ready for this. The Vampire King stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You don't have to be ready, he said softly, his tone more gentle than she had ever heard it. I have chosen you because I believe you can rise to this challenge. You are stronger than you know. She felt a lump form in her throat, and for a moment, she was speechless. She had never felt like this before, like someone truly believed in her. Not in the way her former employers had, but in a way that felt deep, sincere. I don't know what's ahead, she said, her voice trembling. But I do know one thing. I will do whatever it takes to protect them. The Vampire King's expression softened ever so slightly. I know, he said. That is why I chose you. You care about them. That is what they need. The moment felt heavy, as if something had shifted between them. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't just the woman who had stumbled into this world. She was someone who was now tied to the future of this family, and maybe, just maybe, to the Vampire King himself. Rest now, the Vampire King said, his voice once again carrying that commanding tone. You'll need your strength for tomorrow. With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Emily standing in the quiet nursery. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had made her choice, but now that she was in it, she didn't know how it would end. What would the future hold for her, for the boys, for the Vampire King? The questions swirled in her mind, but one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same again. The days passed in a blur for Emily as she continued to adjust to her new life within the walls of the Vampire King's mansion. She had come to realize that this life, for all its luxury, was a world unlike anything she had ever known. The boys, Alexius and Demetrius, were demanding in their own ways. Alexius, the older of the two, had taken to her quickly, though it was clear that he had expectations. He was intelligent, sharp for his age, and his gaze always seemed to analyze everything around him. Demetrius, on the other hand, was quieter, more reserved, yet there was a strength in him that belied his tender age. Emily found herself struggling at times, unsure of how to care for them in the way they needed. Despite the challenges, she worked hard every day, trying to learn their needs, their quirks, and what made them feel safe. Every night, as she tucked them into bed, a strange warmth filled her chest. She was becoming part of their world, their lives, but at times, the weight of her responsibility seemed almost too much to bear. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult day, Emily sat in the vast library, surrounded by shelves of ancient books that smelled of history and power. She ran her fingers along the spines, wondering how many stories these books held, stories that could give her insight into the world she was now a part of. The sound of footsteps echoed from behind her, and when she turned, she found the Vampire King standing in the doorway, his crimson eyes focused intently on her. "You've been spending a lot of time here," he observed, his voice deep and steady. "Is there something you need?" Emily stood quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. "No, I just wanted to learn more," she said, her voice hesitant. "I want to understand this world better. I want to understand what's expected of me." The Vampire King studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There is much to learn," he said, stepping into the room and walking toward one of the nearby shelves. "But be careful, Emily. Some things are better left unknown." Emily frowned, confused by his words. "What do you mean?" The Vampire King turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "The world of vampires is filled with power, but it's also filled with danger. There are forces at play here that you cannot yet comprehend." Emily swallowed, the weight of his words sinking in. "I understand," she said, though she wasn't sure she did. The Vampire King's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You are strong," he said, his voice almost tender. "But remember, strength alone will not be enough to navigate this world. There are forces you must face that will test your resolve, your loyalty, and your very heart." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had known, deep down, that this world would not be easy. But hearing the Vampire King speak of these hidden dangers made it all too real. "I will do what I must," she said quietly, determination seeping into her voice. "For the boys, for this family, I will do whatever it takes." The Vampire King nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing her words. "Good. But remember, Emily, the road ahead will not be easy. There will be sacrifices, and you may find yourself facing choices you never thought you would have to make. Are you ready for that?" Emily's heart raced, her mind racing with the possibilities of what lay ahead. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew she had to be. She had made a promise, not just to the Vampire King, but to the boys. She had already committed herself to a life she hadn't fully understood, and now she would have to face the consequences of that decision. "I'm ready," she said, though the words felt foreign on her tongue. The Vampire King studied her for a long moment, then nodded once more. "We shall see," he said, before turning and walking toward the door. As he left, Emily stood in the library, feeling the weight of his words pressing on her shoulders. There were many things she did not understand, and many more that she was about to face. But one thing was clear, her life would never be the same again. She had chosen this path, and now, she would have to walk it, no matter where it led. Later that evening, as she sat beside the boys, watching them sleep peacefully, Emily found herself lost in thought. The Vampire King's warning lingered in her mind. She had always thought that if she worked hard enough, she could carve out a better life for herself. But now, she was part of something much larger, something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She would have to rely on more than just her strength. She would need to understand the world of vampires, its intricacies, and the hidden forces that governed it. And most importantly, she would need to protect the boys, the future of this world, no matter the cost. The weight of her responsibility pressed down on her, but as she watched the boys sleep, a fierce determination rose within her. She had chosen this life, and she would fight for it, for them, with everything she had. The days that followed were a blur of new routines and growing tension. Emily had settled into her role as the caretaker of the Vampire King's sons, but the weight of the responsibility hung heavy on her shoulders. She had spent countless hours with Alexius and Demetrius, trying to understand their needs, their quirks, and how to make them feel safe. But as much as she cared for them, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head. The boys were more than just children. They were heirs to a legacy she couldn't fully comprehend. Each day, as she watched them interact with their father, she couldn't help but feel like an outsider. The Vampire King had kept his distance, as he always did. He would appear in the evenings, checking on the boys, making sure everything was in order. But it was clear that his attention was divided, his mind always somewhere else. Emily had begun to wonder if he regretted his decision to bring her into their world. One evening, after putting the boys to bed, Emily found herself once again in the library, the familiar scent of ancient books and dust surrounding her. She had come to love this space, its quiet solitude, the way the shadows seemed to swallow her whole. But tonight, the silence felt oppressive. As she wandered through the rows of books, her fingers trailing over the spines, she heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. She turned, and there he was, the Vampire King, his tall form casting a long shadow in the dim light. His crimson eyes locked onto hers. And for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. "You're still here," he said, his voice low, almost amused. "I thought you would have retired for the night." Emily swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly, her voice betraying her unease. The Vampire King regarded her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't sleep well?" he asked, his tone curious, though there was a hint of something more. Emily hesitated before speaking. "I'm not sure I belong here," she admitted. "Everything is so different. The boys, this place, it's all so overwhelming." The Vampire King's expression softened, but only for a moment. "You're doing well," he said, his voice more gentle than she had expected. "The boys are adjusting to you. They trust you." Emily's heart fluttered at his words. She had never felt this type of validation before, not from anyone. But there was something else, something in the way he spoke that made her feel like she was more than just a caretaker, more than just a servant. "I'm trying my best," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King stepped closer, his presence almost suffocating. "You don't have to try," he said softly. "You already have. That's enough for me." Emily felt a strange warmth spread through her chest, but before she could respond, he turned away, his cloak sweeping behind him. "The boys are safe with you," he said, his voice distant once more. "I will take care of everything else." Emily watched him as he walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the vast library. A part of her wanted to ask him what that meant, that last part. What was it that he was taking care of? What was it that he hadn't told her yet? But the words stuck in her throat, and instead, she simply nodded. "Good night," he said, his back to her now. "Sleep well." As the door clicked shut behind him, Emily stood in the silence, her mind spinning. She had come to realize that there was far more to this world than she could have ever imagined. She was not just raising the Vampire King's sons. She was part of a much larger game, one that she wasn't sure she was ready to play. There were things in this mansion, things that went beyond the daily routines, beyond the boys, beyond the Vampire King himself. And as much as she wanted to understand, to be a part of it, she knew that the more she learned, the more she would have to give up. She would have to sacrifice parts of herself. She would have to make choices that would define her future. Emily lay in her bed that night, her thoughts racing. The Vampire King's words echoed in her mind. "The boys are safe with you." But were they? What about her? Was she safe? Or was she simply another pawn in a game she didn't understand? As sleep finally claimed her, Emily's last thought was a simple question. What would the future hold for her and the boys? And could she handle whatever it was? The following weeks were filled with more questions than answers for Emily. As she settled into her role within the mansion, caring for the Vampire King's sons, she began to feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. The days blurred into one another, filled with routine and the quiet. yet powerful presence of the Vampire King. Despite the calm of the mansion, something in the air felt different, charged. There were whispers among the servants, and even the guards seemed to act a little more distant. Something was happening, and Emily couldn't help but feel that it was somehow connected to her. It was one of those quiet evenings when the moon was full and the air was thick with tension. Emily had just finished putting the boys to bed and was walking through the corridors when she noticed something unusual. There was an unfamiliar silence hanging in the mansion, an eerie stillness that sent a chill down her spine. She had grown accustomed to the silence of the house, but this was different. As she walked deeper into the heart of the mansion, she heard soft voices, hushed conversations just beyond the grand dining room. Curious, she moved closer, peering around the corner. The Vampire King was there, speaking to a man Emily had never seen before. The man was tall, with sharp features and a presence that seemed to dominate the room despite the Vampire King's commanding aura. His eyes were an unsettling shade of gold, like the color of a wolf's eyes, wild and untamed. "You've made your decision then?" the man asked, his voice low and smooth, but there was an edge to it, something dangerous. The Vampire King stood tall, his usual calm demeanor betraying a hint of something darker. "I have," he replied, his tone firm. "It's time. The boys must be ready." Emily's heart raced as she tried to make sense of what she was hearing. The boys. Ready for what? What was happening? She knew the Vampire King had plans for his sons, but this felt different. The man's eyes flickered to her, and she froze, instinctively taking a step back. There was no mistaking it. He had seen her. His gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "Ah, our new caretaker," the man said, a slight smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. "The one who's been entrusted with the future of the kingdom." Emily's throat went dry as she stepped forward, feeling trapped between them. The Vampire King's gaze shifted to her as well, but there was no warmth in it, only a piercing cold. "Emily," he said simply. "This is Kieran. He is one of the council members, and he is here for an important matter." Kieran gave her a small nod, his golden eyes still studying her with unsettling curiosity. "It's good to finally meet the woman who will be raising the future of our kind," he said, his voice smooth, yet laced with something darker. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Raising the future of their kind? What did that mean? She wasn't prepared for this, for the enormity of the task she had been handed. She was just a maid, an ordinary woman thrust into a world she barely understood. The Vampire King, seeing her discomfort, spoke again, his voice soft but commanding. "Kieran has come to discuss the boys' training," he explained. "It's time for them to begin preparing for their roles, and for you to begin your lessons as well." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Lessons? What kind of lessons?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kieran's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You will need to learn much more than just how to care for children," he said. "The boys are not just heirs to a throne. They are part of a legacy that spans centuries. It is important that you understand the full weight of what that means." The Vampire King's eyes locked onto hers again. "You will need to learn how to raise them to become leaders, rulers. You will need to teach them more than what any normal mother would." Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. She wasn't prepared for this. She wasn't prepared to become a teacher, a guide, for children who were destined for something far beyond her comprehension. She wasn't prepared to enter a world so full of secrets, power, and danger. "You are part of this now," the Vampire King continued, his voice low and steady. "There is no going back. If you are to truly raise them, you must understand the world they will inherit, and you must be willing to protect them at all costs." Kieran stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "It won't be easy," he said, his voice hard, "and there will be forces that will test your resolve. But you, Emily, are stronger than you realize. You have the potential to become something far more than you are now." Emily swallowed, trying to steady her racing thoughts. What had she gotten herself into? Was she truly ready for this? She had made her choice, but now that the reality of her situation was staring her in the face, she wasn't so sure. The future of the Vampire King's sons, of the entire kingdom, rested in her hands. She had already begun her journey, but there was no telling where it would lead. Would she be able to handle the weight of it all? Or would the darkness of this world swallow her whole? The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of lessons and discoveries. Emily had begun her formal training with Kieran, the council member, as promised. The Vampire King had made it clear that she had a crucial role to play in raising his sons, but he had also emphasized the importance of understanding their world. The boys, Alexius and Demetrius, were still adjusting to having her around, but Emily could see that they were becoming more comfortable with her each day. Alexius, the older of the two, still carried the weight of a future leader, but his occasional moments of vulnerability reminded Emily that he was still a child at heart. Demetrius, though only 3 years old, had an unsettling presence that made Emily wonder what kind of man he would become. There was something about him, something old, something wise, that made her shiver at times. But she had a job to do, and her focus was on them. She had made a promise to protect them, to guide them, and she would do everything she could to honor that promise. Her lessons with Kieran were intense. They weren't just about raising the boys. They were about understanding the ancient power that governed their lives. The Vampire King's kingdom was built on a foundation of magic and blood, and Emily quickly realized that nothing was as it seemed. There were customs, rituals, and secrets that ran deeper than she had ever imagined. She was learning about the old laws of the vampire world, the importance of bloodlines, and the politics that came with it. She had been told that she was part of this world now, but she was beginning to understand that it was not just about serving the Vampire King and raising his sons. It was about survival. The dangers were real. There were factions, rival families, and enemies lurking in the shadows. And Emily was now entangled in it all. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and the mansion grew colder, Emily found herself alone in the garden, trying to clear her mind. The beauty of the night, with its silver moonlight casting a soft glow over the sprawling grounds, did little to ease her troubled thoughts. She had been spending so much time with the boys and in her lessons that she had little time to herself. She had thought the decision to come here would be easier. She had thought that once she entered this world, she would be free of her past. But the more she learned, the more she realized how little she truly knew. The quiet night was broken by the sound of footsteps approaching. Emily turned to see the Vampire King standing at the edge of the garden, his dark cloak billowing around him like a shadow. "I see you found some peace," he said, his voice soft yet still commanding. "It's rare for you to be alone." Emily didn't know what to say. She had gotten used to his presence, to the way he always seemed to be watching, always seemed to be aware of her movements. "I needed some time to think," she said, trying to steady her breath. The Vampire King regarded her for a moment before stepping closer. "I've seen your progress," he said. "You've done well with the boys." Emily nodded, though she wasn't sure if she agreed with him. She was still learning, still figuring out how to balance the role of protector and teacher. "But there is more to this than just caring for them," the Vampire King continued. "The world you've entered is far more dangerous than you realize, and I cannot protect you from everything." His words sent a chill down Emily's spine. She had heard whispers of danger, of enemies within and outside the mansion, but she had never been directly warned by the Vampire King himself. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King's gaze darkened. "There are forces that would seek to use the boys, to control them," he said, his tone sharp. "There are those who would do anything to undermine my power, to take what I've built, and they will not hesitate to strike at anything they can use against me." Emily felt her heart race. "And what do you want me to do?" she asked, the weight of his words settling on her chest. "You're more than just a caretaker," the Vampire King replied, his eyes locking onto hers. "You are their protector. You must be ready for the challenges that lie ahead. There are enemies within the kingdom who would use you, manipulate you to get to them. I cannot always be there to protect you." The Vampire King's words were heavy, but there was something in his gaze that held her in place. It was a strange mixture of concern and expectation. Emily realized then that her role was far greater than she had thought. She was not just raising his sons. She was part of a much larger battle, and she was about to be tested in ways she never expected. "I will protect them," Emily said, her voice steady now, her resolve hardening. "I will do whatever it takes." The Vampire King studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good," he said. "But remember, this is not a game. The stakes are real, and the cost can be high. If you falter, it will not only be your life at risk, it will be theirs as well." As he turned to leave, Emily stood there in the garden, her thoughts swirling. She had made a promise, but she hadn't realized just how dangerous this world was. She had thought that she was simply stepping into a life of security, but the truth was far more complicated. She had been drawn into a world of power, politics, and blood, and now she had to navigate it, not just for herself, but for the future of the Vampire King's sons. What she didn't know yet was how far she was willing to go to keep that promise. What would be the cost of her loyalty? The days that followed were filled with a quiet, growing tension. Emily had begun to feel the full weight of her responsibility. The Vampire King's warning echoed in her mind as she moved through the mansion, her every step calculated, as though the walls themselves were watching her. She had been thrown into a world that was both strange and familiar, a world where power was measured in blood and where loyalty could be the difference between life and death. She had come to understand the delicate balance of the mansion, how every decision had far-reaching consequences. Her role as the caretaker of the Vampire King's sons had grown far beyond what she had expected. She was no longer just raising 2 children. She was raising future rulers, heirs to a kingdom filled with secrets, power, and danger. Every day, she learned something new about their world, but each revelation only seemed to raise more questions. There were whispers in the mansion, rumors of forces that sought to overthrow the Vampire King, to seize control of the kingdom. And while Emily focused on her duty to the boys, she could not shake the feeling that there was something more, something hidden beneath the surface of this gilded world. One evening, as Emily sat alone in the boys' nursery, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was the Vampire King. His dark presence filled the room, and for a moment, she felt a strange pull in her chest. He stepped inside, his crimson eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart race. "There is something I need to discuss with you," he said, his voice low and commanding. "It's about the boys." Emily stood quickly, a knot forming in her stomach. "What is it? Are they all right?" The Vampire King's gaze softened, but only slightly. "They are fine," he said, "but their training must begin in earnest. The world is changing, and I can no longer afford to shelter them from what's to come." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Training? What kind of training? The Vampire King turned to look at the boys, who were peacefully sleeping in their cribs. "They must learn to control their abilities. Their powers are growing stronger, and they will need to know how to wield them when the time comes. They must also learn how to lead, how to rule. The kingdom is not a safe place, and they must be ready for what lies ahead." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that the boys were special, but hearing it from the Vampire King himself made the reality of their future hit her with full force. I don't know how to help them with that," she admitted, her voice trembling. The Vampire King's gaze softened for a moment, his expression unreadable. "That is why I am asking for your help," he said quietly. "You have a unique perspective. You understand what it means to be human, to have limitations. I need you to teach them not just about their powers, but about the world beyond this mansion. About the people they will one day rule." Emily's mind raced. This was not what she had signed up for. She had thought that her role was simple, to care for the boys, to keep them safe. But now, she was being asked to prepare them for a future that she could barely understand herself. "I don't know if I can do that," she said, her voice shaky. The Vampire King stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You can," he said simply. "I believe in you, Emily. You have more strength than you realize." His words sent a wave of warmth through her chest, but also a surge of fear. She had no experience in the world of politics, in the world of power and rule. How was she supposed to teach them to navigate it? The Vampire King seemed to sense her hesitation. "Don't worry," he said, his tone softening slightly. "You will not do this alone. I will be there to guide you, to guide them. But you must prepare yourself. The future is coming, and it is not a future that will wait for us." Emily nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the responsibility he was asking of her. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the challenges that lay ahead. But she knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. She had made a choice, and the future of the Vampire King's sons rested in her hands. As the Vampire King turned and left the room, Emily stood there, her mind racing. She had once dreamed of a life beyond her struggles, a life where she didn't have to fight for every scrap of food, for every breath of freedom. But now, She was part of a world where power and danger lurked around every corner. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. What kind of world had she entered? And could she survive it? As the weight of her decision settled on her, Emily knew one thing. There was no going back. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and dangers, but she had to walk it, for the boys, for the Vampire King, and for herself. The days that followed felt like a blur, a constant whirl of new lessons and growing tension. Emily had always prided herself on her ability to adapt, but nothing could have prepared her for the responsibility that now lay heavy on her shoulders. The Vampire King's sons, Alexius and Demetrius, were beginning their training in earnest, and with each passing day, the expectations placed on Emily seemed to grow. Her lessons with Kieran, the council member, had become more intense, each session delving deeper into the intricacies of the vampire world, its history, and its politics. But it wasn't just the boys who needed guidance. Emily herself was learning to navigate a world far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The mansion, once a place of comfort, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets and power struggles. She had once believed that by accepting the Vampire King's offer, she was stepping into a life of security and stability. But the more she learned, the more she realized how little she understood about the world she had entered. The training for the boys was grueling. Alexius, with his sharp mind and commanding presence, embraced it with a fierce determination. But even he seemed to struggle with the weight of what was expected of him. Demetrius, the younger of the two, was a mystery. His quiet nature, coupled with the strange, almost unnatural strength that seemed to radiate from him, made Emily uneasy at times. It was as though he knew more than he should for a child of his age. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Emily found herself standing by the boys' crib, watching them sleep. Their peaceful faces were a stark contrast to the intensity of the days they had just endured. It was hard to believe that these two young children would one day be expected to rule, to carry the weight of an entire kingdom on their shoulders. Emily couldn't help but wonder if they were truly ready. She had promised to protect them, to raise them, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking a fine line. One wrong step, and everything could fall apart. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned, and there he was, the Vampire King. He had a way of entering a room that made it feel as though the very air shifted with his presence. His crimson eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she forgot how to breathe. "You've been busy," he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made her stomach tighten. Emily nodded, unsure of how to respond. She had grown accustomed to his presence, but it still unsettled her, the way he seemed to always be watching, always calculating. "The boys are doing well," she said finally, her voice steady. "They're learning." The Vampire King studied her for a moment before stepping closer. "I trust you're doing more than just teaching them how to fight," he said, his tone laced with something darker. Emily's heart skipped a beat. "Of course," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm teaching them about the world, about what they will one day inherit." He nodded, though there was something unreadable in his gaze. "You are raising more than just children, Emily," he said softly. "You are shaping the future of our kind, and I cannot afford for you to fail." The weight of his words hung in the air, suffocating her. She had never felt more aware of the immense responsibility she now carried. The future of the Vampire King's kingdom rested on the boys, and on her ability to guide them. "I won't fail," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. The Vampire King looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a small nod, he turned and walked toward the door. "I know you won't," he said over his shoulder. "But remember, Emily, there are forces at play here that you do not yet understand. You must be ready for anything." His words echoed in her mind long after he had left the room. She was beginning to realize that she was no longer just a maid, no longer just a caretaker. She was part of a much larger story, one that she could not control. And the more she learned, the more she understood that the price of failure was something far greater than she could imagine. As she stood there in the quiet of the nursery, her thoughts racing, Emily knew that she had made a choice. There was no turning back now. The Vampire King's sons were her responsibility. Their future was now in her hands, and she would do whatever it took to protect them. But at what cost? She had come here, seeking a new life, a life away from the struggles of her past. But now, the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. She was no longer just a participant in her own story. She was in the middle of a web of power, politics, and ancient forces, and she had no idea how deep it went. The road ahead was uncertain, but Emily knew one thing for sure. She was no longer the woman who had walked into this mansion all those weeks ago. The woman standing here now had a purpose, a role to play in a much larger game. And whether she was ready or not, the future was waiting for her to step into it. The weight of Emily's new life continued to press down on her, but she was learning to bear it. The Vampire King's sons were growing, and with each passing day, the responsibility that had once seemed so distant now felt more immediate. She had made a promise to protect them, to raise them, but the challenges she faced were not just about managing the boys. They were about surviving in a world that was not her own, a world where power and danger were constant companions. She had come to realize that every action she took, every decision she made, had consequences. There were enemies lurking in the shadows, and the deeper she ventured into the world of vampires, the more she could sense that they were watching her. The mansion, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. It was a gilded cage, and Emily was trapped within it. She had tried to find comfort in the quiet moments, when she could sit with Alexius and Demetrius, but even those moments were tinged with the weight of the future. Alexius, with his sharp mind and strong will, was beginning to understand the power he held. He had always been precocious, but now he was becoming aware of his place in the world, and it terrified Emily. Demetrius, on the other hand, was a mystery. He seemed to carry an old soul within him, one that Emily could not understand, and it unsettled her. He had moments of clarity, of depth, that made him seem far older than his 3 years. Emily could see that the boys were changing, and with them, her role was evolving. She wasn't just a caretaker anymore. She was shaping their future, teaching them the skills they would need to survive in a world of politics, power, and blood. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily found herself once again in the library, trying to find some solace among the pages of ancient texts. The Vampire King had given her access to the knowledge of his kind, and she had spent countless hours poring over the books, trying to understand the intricate web of politics and history that surrounded her. She had learned of the Vampire King's reign, of the ancient laws that governed his kingdom, and of the many factions that fought for control of the empire. She had also learned of the dangers that lurked just beyond the mansion's walls, the rival families, the enemies within the kingdom, and the dark forces that sought to destroy everything the Vampire King had built. Emily had been warned, but the reality of it was sinking in slowly. She wasn't just raising the Vampire King's sons. She was raising the future rulers of a kingdom that was under constant threat. She was learning the price of power and the cost of failure. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see the Vampire King standing in the doorway. His crimson eyes were sharp, his expression unreadable as usual. "You've been spending a lot of time in here," he said, his voice low. "Are you finding what you need?" Emily closed the book in her hands, not sure how to answer. "I'm learning," she said quietly, "but it's overwhelming." The Vampire King stepped inside, his gaze lingering on the pages of the books she had been reading. "It is," he said, "but you must learn if you are to help them. The boys will need more than just your care. They will need your wisdom, your strength. And that means understanding the world they will one day rule." Emily nodded, feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. "I understand," she said, though she wasn't sure she did. She had come to realize that there was no way to fully prepare for what was to come. There were too many unknowns, too many dangers, and too many forces at play. The Vampire King watched her closely, as if reading her thoughts. "You have done well," he said after a moment. "The boys trust you, but the world will not wait for them. You must teach them to lead, to fight, and to rule. And you must teach yourself how to survive in this world, for it will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine." Emily's heart raced. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The Vampire King's gaze darkened. "There are forces within the kingdom that would seek to tear it apart. They will stop at nothing to gain power, and they will use anyone they can. Even you." His words sent a chill down Emily's spine. She had heard rumors, whispers of betrayal and power struggles, but hearing it from him made it all the more real. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Vampire King's eyes softened for a moment. You must be strong, Emily. For them. For yourself. The boys are more than just heirs to a throne. They are the future of our kind. And it is your job to make sure they are ready to face what lies ahead. Emily swallowed hard, the weight of his words pressing down on her. I will do everything I can, she said, her voice filled with determination. The Vampire King nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned and walked toward the door. I know you will, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. As he left, Emily sat there in the dimly lit library, the weight of the world settling on her shoulders. She had made a promise to protect the boys, but she had no idea what that would truly mean. She was about to step into a world of power, danger, and betrayal, and there was no turning back. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. She would have to be strong, not just for them, but for herself. The road ahead was full of shadows, but Emily knew she couldn't walk it alone. She had to be ready for whatever came next. The months that followed felt like a constant storm, swirling around Emily as she tried to hold her ground. The weight of her responsibilities was now fully realized. She was no longer just a caretaker, not simply a maid or a stranger who had stumbled into the Vampire King's world. She had become an integral part of the kingdom's future. The boys, Alexius and Demetrius, had grown in both strength and confidence under her care. Alexius, ever the precocious one, embraced his training with a sharp focus, while Demetrius, though quieter, had an uncanny ability to grasp things quickly, as if his young mind held the wisdom of centuries. Emily had watched both of them with a sense of awe, knowing that they were destined for greatness, but also aware that they were children, too, with their own fears, desires, and vulnerabilities. Every day, Emily taught them not just the ways of the world, but how to navigate the complex web of vampire politics. She had come to understand the weight of the Vampire King's legacy and the fragile balance of power that held his kingdom together. And she knew, deep down, that one day, Alexius and Demetrius would be the ones to hold it all in their hands. But the more she taught them, the more Emily felt like she was being drawn deeper into a world she didn't fully understand. The mansion, once a place of safety, now seemed more like a battlefield, where every word, every action had consequences. The Vampire King, though still distant, had made it clear that the stakes were higher than ever. Forces within the kingdom, rival factions, hungry for power, were beginning to make their move, and Emily could feel the tension building. One evening, as the boys had gone to bed, Emily found herself once again in the library, poring over old tomes, searching for any clue about the next steps she should take. The sound of footsteps broke her focus, and she turned to see the Vampire King standing in the doorway. His presence, as always, filled the room, his crimson eyes fixing on her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "You're still awake," he said, his voice deep, carrying an edge of something she couldn't quite place. Emily set the book down, her gaze meeting his. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice steady. "There's too much to think about." The Vampire King stepped closer, his cloak flowing behind him like a shadow. "There always will be," he said. "But you are handling it well. The boys are learning, and so are you." Emily met his gaze, unsure of how to respond. She had learned so much, but the more she knew, the more she realized how much more there was to understand. "But I'm still unsure," she confessed. "There's so much at stake. So many enemies. I'm afraid I won't be able to protect them, protect all of us." The Vampire King's expression softened ever so slightly. "You are stronger than you think, Emily. You've proven that time and again." His words, though reassuring, didn't fully ease her fears. "I'm not ready for this," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay composed. "I don't know if I can handle everything that's coming." The Vampire King's gaze was steady as he stepped closer, his presence almost overwhelming. "No one is ever truly ready for what they must face," he said softly. "Not even I was ready for this life, but we adapt, we learn, and we fight." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily felt her heart beat faster. The weight of his words, the truth in them, resonated deeply within her. She had chosen this path, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that it wasn't just about protecting the boys or following the Vampire King's commands. It was about something deeper, about survival. About facing the darkness and finding a way to navigate it. You're not alone in this, the Vampire King said, as though reading her mind. I will guide you, and so will the boys. You have become part of this family, Emily. You are not just their protector. You are their mother, and I will not let anything harm you, or them. His words, though comforting, filled her with an undeniable sense of dread. She had come to understand the depth of the Vampire King's power and the danger that came with it. There were enemies out there, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. And she would have to be ready for whatever came next. She stood there in the library, her mind racing with everything she had learned and everything she still didn't understand. But in that moment, something inside her clicked. She had made a promise to protect the boys, to protect their future. And no matter how much danger awaited, she would fight for them, for their future, and for her own. She had entered this world as an outsider, unsure of her place, but now, she was part of it. She was part of something much bigger than herself, and she would do whatever it took to ensure that Alexius and Demetrius would rise to the challenge of their destiny. Whatever it took. The Vampire King stepped back, his expression unreadable. Rest, he said quietly, his voice softer now. Tomorrow, we begin again. As he left the room, Emily stood there in the silence, the weight of his words settling over her. There was no turning back. This was her life now, and the future was waiting for her to embrace it, whatever the cost.